So, Frank, one of the things I got to say about your piece in the Huffington Post, it's an open letter to the Republican leadership that I found exceptional, was how you walked us through the creation of, if not Donald Trump, at least the phenomena of Donald Trump. But let's start back with you start by talking about Bob Dole and Bob Dole's running mate back in the I guess it was the mid 90s now, Jack Kemp. Track it for us from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wrote this open letter to the Republican leadership, and the first thing I tell them is, hey, guys, I was one of you. Back in the 70s and 80s, my father, Francis Schaeffer, and me teamed up with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who then became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, and we were the people who most historians now credit with essentially kicking off the Protestant pro-life anti-abortion movement. We did it with a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Back in those days, we also were very politically connected, and I would meet frequently with Jack Kemp. We met President Reagan. We had Mike, who was Ford's son, staying with us and working with us. I'm talking about Gerald Ford's son. We were connected with the Republican establishment, so I knew those guys back then. In fact, I even stayed in Jack and Joanne's home in Washington when he was running for the vice presidency with Bob Dole. The point I'm making is, look, you could disagree with the policies of these guys. You could say trickle-down economics didn't work, whatever, but nobody would ever have looked at Jack Kemp and say one of two things. No one ever called him a racist, and no one ever said he was lunatic fringe. Look, he reached out to black people. He had played with them as a football player. He had black friends, real friends that, came over for dinner, not just token friends. He went after funding for health and human services and housing development for the African American community. So what I'm trying to say is if you draw a line between then and now, and I got out of the Republican movement about 25 years ago in disgust over their gay bashing and their closing the doors on women's rights and the rest of it. But if you looked at those people and then you looked at what's happened to the Republican Party, you would assume that even Ronald Reagan would be called a liberal Democrat today by comparison, because he wasn't a xenophobe, he wasn't an isolationist, he reached out to people of other color. These folks would be disgusted, for instance, with the Republicans today who won't even talk to President Obama's nominee for a Supreme Court justice. They didn't play by those sorts of rules. They were regular politicians. They were not ideological people. So what I talk about is, look, what's happened with people like Ted Cruz, for instance, is that, he's kind of like we were back then, a right-wing nutcase agitator outsider. The difference is we were knocking on politicians' doors, asking them to meet with us. He's actually in the Senate.
Right.
He's running for president. And when you get to Barack Obama and the way he's been opposed and the way he's been vilified and lied about, you have proof of their extremism. I mean, these are the guys that said he wasn't born in America, that he's a Muslim, that he's a communist, that he's not a Christian. You add all these contradictory statements up, but it's come from the mainstream of the party. So now fast forward to Donald Trump. These people, like the Koch brothers and these insider establishment people, are whining, saying somehow the party's been stolen from them. Who paid for the damn Tea Party? The Koch brothers.
Right.
Who set up and in motion this kind of fifth column of traitorous, American-hating, right-wing extremists who have then coalesced to become Donald Trump's foot soldiers? The Koch brothers, the Republican establishment. They made a big mistake. They made the same mistake that so many people have made in history, thinking that you can coddle a monster, whether it's a bully in a sidewalk or an enforcer or a dictator like Mussolini and Hitler and these people, and somehow after they've done what you need them to do, which in the case of the Tea Party was to vilify Barack Obama's presidency and to squander his leadership by opposing him, and then turn around and somehow rein in your attack dog.
Right.
Well, you can't rein in your attack dogs, and Donald Trump is the result. He's not an aberration. This is the logical conclusion of where these idiots have gone with funding right-wing extremism, thinking they could then rein it in. Well, they couldn't, and now it's out of the bag, and he's going to be the nominee.
I think people forget that Donald Trump basically made his hay as a Republican icon, as a conservative icon, by providing at least some exposure to the idea that President Obama was not born in this country. He was one of the original, if not one of the original, but one of the biggest megaphones for the idea of the birther movement. And people forget that all the major Republican candidates in 2012 went to go kiss his ring in New York City.
Right.
And of course, New York's not a state where any Republican candidate thought they were going to win anyways. So they were doing this for the national Republican party's ingestion, right? This was not a local New York thing.
No, and what they did is they allowed him to say what they couldn't say, so they had to pretend that they weren't sure about the birth thing.
That's
and then
right.
They got him as an entertainer and public figure and this mogul to say stuff they didn't dare say, wink, wink, nod, nod, oh, well, it's not me saying it, it's Donald saying it. And they used him as a kind of a foil to advance with the kind of people who believe this nonsense, these ideas. And essentially what we've got in Donald Trump, obviously, is a megalomaniac. He's a narcissist, all these things people say, but really what you've got in him, forget the man for a minute, you have the symbol of the derangement that has overtaken the Republican Party. This is no longer a normal political party. This is a deranged group of sociopaths. Seriously, I don't mean every individual Republican voter. I'm talking about the character of the party is sociopathic. It is now built on only one thing: 7.5 years of vilification of our first black president, period. That's what the party's been about. They have threatened to shut down the government. They have threatened to destroy the world economy rather than funding his health care proposals. They have lied about him. They've used people like Donald Trump as a megaphone to spread lies that even they know are not true. The fact of the matter is they now have got exactly what they deserve. And I predict a sweeping victory for the Democrats this fall. I predict that the Republicans will lose the Senate. And 100 years from now, when the history books are written, they're going to forget the details, and they're going to say that this was the final bubbling up of the hate-filled, racist, white, underclass, underbelly of America. This is the last lynching, if you want to put it this way, that they will get away with. If you look at the history of the presidency of Barack Obama, I wrote a piece once that had a lot of downloads called The Slow Motion Lynching of President Barack Obama. I told the truth as I see it in that piece, and that is obviously he has not really been lynched in physical terms, but what they have done to him essentially is gather a mob and drag him to the edge of the town, as it were. They have not hung him, but what they've done is they have obstructed him on a basis, step by step, that has nothing to do with logic. Just take one thing, the health care reform debate that centered around what he was doing as if it was something outlandish, when in fact it was something a Republican governor came up with in my own state here in Massachusetts. And they treated it like it was from outer space. That's not a very dramatic thing, but when you think about it and you add it to everything else, what we've seen with President Obama is the backlash against a black man sitting in the White House who was elected by the majority of Americans twice, as if somehow he's not a legitimate president.
That's right. I mean, we see it. And frankly,
he was George Bush, who was elected on a few hanging chads in Florida, whereas he had a significant vote, and they treat him as if he's not the real president.
And Frank, we should say that nothing highlights that more, at least this week, than the idea that the Senate would not even entertain the idea of him nominating a replacement for Antonin Scalia. I want to ask you, what is it about evangelicals that are, I don't know if flocking is the right word, to Donald Trump as the natural, logical culmination of 8 years of the Republican Party, the conservative movement, essentially basing their entire existence on a backlash to an African American, to a black president, and it filters in everything else. I mean,
let me just say one thing. I just got to add something right there. Not just a black president who 20 years ago would have been a moderate Republican. I mean,
Right.
This guy, talk about somebody who's not of the far left. Jack Kemp and George W. Bush Sr. or Gerald Ford and Barack Obama all would have gotten along fine. They would have had some different policies on economics. But when it came to health care reform, for instance, this was what Jack Kemp was pushing for. And
Yes.
other people before him, even Nixon. So let me just add that as a caveat. The irony here is that the Republicans are stripped of all excuses. Had he been a radical leftist, if he had had policies that could have been described that way, you'd say, okay, well, it could be about policy. 20, 30, 40 years ago, he has not been any more radical than Eisenhower was.
Well, I mean, isn't Donald Trump's ascendancy also evidence that it's never been about policy? Because Donald Trump is to the left of Barack Obama on trade deals. He is
Right.
arguably to the left of Barack Obama, at least where Barack Obama was on Social Security and Medicare in terms of refusing to cut it.
Right.
He is. I mean, this is indicative of the fact, it seems to me, that the Republican Party, at least a huge swath of them, at least the center of the
Right.
party, the ballast of the party, is really more about what they call anti-PC, which is just simply another way of saying we want to be able to articulate our racism, our misogyny, and even if we can't put it into practice, we resent the fact that we can't articulate it anymore.
What happened recently? Gordon College, which is near me in Massachusetts, has a president who's very right-wing now, who's getting rid of professors who gainsay him, and he wrote a letter to President Obama demanding to be exempted from ordinary anti-discrimination laws for any gay people he finds teaching in his college. He wants to be able to fire them without due process, and he said it's a religious freedom. Wheaton College, this evangelical bastion near Chicago, went to the Supreme Court like the Hobby Lobby case, argued and won so that they wouldn't have to provide contraception coverage for insurance purposes to their female employees. All of this is being done in the name of religious freedom. So look at this. What is religious freedom boiling down to now in these evangelical groups? Right-wing reaction against women, right-wing reaction against gays, right-wing reaction against black people, couched as religious freedom. So religious freedom now becomes the catchphrase for stripping other people of their civil liberties. That is the whole deal in a nutshell. And that's where the evangelical right has gone that I used to be part of, that I've written about in books like my Crazy for God, which is a memoir, or my new book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. That's what these books are about. And all I'm doing is tracing a course saying, listen, not only are these people off the rails, even judged by their own standards 30 years ago, they're radical bomb throwers.
What was it? I mean, how does one, and maybe this is an obvious question, but how does one grow this in an era where society at large is moving in the other direction? Or is it because society at large is moving in a certain direction?
You got it. That's it. Listen, this is a xenophobic stand of a white minority within a minority, in the sense that it's not just the overall demographic. There's a lot of white people who voted for Barack Obama and who think he's a good president today. I'm not talking about all white people, but just like the primary caucuses are really come down, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Right.
It comes down to 20 or 30,000 people out of a country of 360 million or whatever we are today. And you look at this, well, this is the same phenomena. This racist white minority within the white minority is the tail wagging the dog. And if we could just get past these voter registration things that have curtailed black voting and discouraged it, if we could just get past the gerrymandering, if we could just get a Supreme Court justice that would roll back the big money incursion into politics, the dark money that the Koch brothers and other people have been lavishing into our system, 100 million at a pop, the actual vote of the American people, when you get to the real American people, is not as racist and xenophobic as these guys by a long shot. We elected Barack Obama, but then this group of people, this Tea Party minority, this group funded by the Koch brothers that's now biting them in the butt by pushing the extremes and making them look bad, they have delegitimized the presidency of Barack Obama because he's black, period. That's it. There are no policy discussions here. It's straight out racism.
Again, we mentioned this in the first half, but I mean, we could see that in the context of Trump. All right, so let me ask you this: do you think? I mean, because I agree with you. I think it's quite clear now that Trump is going to be the nominee, and there really is no strong rational argument.
And just to prove what we're both saying, what was the statement of his that really got everybody fired up in his corner of these people? When he called Mexicans rapists.
Right.
When he said they were all killers and criminals. When
right.
he said he'd build a wall like the Berlin Wall to make America look like a dictatorship. When he talked about bombing things flat. In other words, what was the thing that keyed everything off? What endeared him to the hearts of the Barack Obama haters? It was to be told that he knew how to take care of these brown people and stop them coming in here, period. That's what got them all energized. If he had talked about anything else first, he never would have gotten their attention. The minute he zeroed in on some poor little girl coming across the border with her older sister because her skin is brown and call her a rapist as she's locked up in a child care facility for wanting to come and join her mother or to escape a rape in her own country being trafficked or whatever, if you look at what Donald did as the foundation of this campaign, it's one of the ugliest racist slurs in the memory of American people. There are people in the Jim Crow South who didn't label everybody who was black and brown a rapist. He did. And then he backed off a little bit, but that's what got this thing fired up, was straight out bigotry.
I absolutely agree with you. And I should say, and we should make it clear, that what Donald Trump did was he just listed off a litany. He spoke for an hour and a half, I think, that day. And so it was less that he thought that he was going to be able to run and launch his campaign off the idea that Mexican immigrants or that Latin American children coming in are rapists and criminals. It was that he hung out a lot of things. And that was the thing that attracted a huge percentage of Republicans and provided the electoral foundation for what we're seeing today. Frank Schaeffer, thank you so much for your time today. We will, of course, link to that piece in the Huffington Post at ringoffireradio.com.
Thanks a lot.